Welcome back to the class, and in this class we will have some discussion about conflict theory. And again, it's a very broad theoretical orientation, one among the three theoretical orientations of modern sociological theories. As we discussed in the previous class, the structural functionalism, conflict theory, and interactionism are widely considered as the three major streams of sociological theorizations of modern sociological theory, the kinds of theory that emerged after 1930s and that maybe was relevant up to 1980s. And though we say that these theoretical traditions are relevant, after 80s you see a kind of a splintering of these theoretical traditions and an addition of lot more traditions and a lot more orientations, theoretical arguments coming into picture. So why I decided to devote 3 sessions to each of these three traditions is basically to give you a very broad overview. And I know that it's a very sketchy, extremely superficial, extremely sketchy elaboration. I am not able to go into any of the thinkers in a detailed manner. I am not able to discuss anything more substantive, but I only would be able to give you a very broad overview of the transformation of the trajectory of these theoretical traditions, and to introduce you these scholars. So once you want to study modern sociological theories, it might be helpful for you. That's the only intention. Otherwise, these discussions what we had yesterday about the structural functionalism and today's discussion on conflict theory and the next class's discussion on interactions theory are all going to be extremely sketchy and very superficial. So conflict theory, it emerges as an alternative to functional theorization, and it became more influential in sociological theorizing. And we know that we discussed Karl Marx in detail, and it becomes very evident that the very theoretical as well as intellectual as well as political motives of Karl Marx is very different from that of the other sociologists. Okay, that's a very important thing. Why that what were the factors that really motivated the intellectual journey of Karl Marx? Okay, see, intellectual quest is a common thing for any intellectual, any scholar for that matter. But what were the kind of a peculiar motivations, peculiar sense of triggers, a peculiar kind of inspiration for Karl Marx? And the kind of, we know that kind of inspiration, that kind of anger, that kind of a passion was not shared by a lot of other equally important sociologists. Marx was an unusual person. Marx had a very strong political project at hand. One of the important things that really inspired Marx was this whole question of equality. The whole question of equality, the dream or the image of a more egalitarian society, and his unending quest to understand why there are people living in completely different kind of situations, why that there is so much of power inequality, and why there is so much of exploitation, why there is so much of discrimination, and why that a handful of people, a minority, is able to rule over the vast majority of the people. And especially we discussed that his entire answer revolved around the question of economy, the role of money, role of labor. I'm not going into that, but that particular preoccupation to critically analyze the social structure and with an urge to bring about change was something quite radically opposite to that of the theorist who propounded functional theory. You know that the social change and social order, they don't go together. They cannot go hand in hand. One is seen as the opposite of the other. In a society which is full of social change, you can't really talk about social equality, social equilibrium, or social stability. While we know that societies have both these elements, certain peculiar time periods would represent a phase of rapid social changes or a phase of prolonged equilibrium or prolonged status quo. So Marx was interested in the question of change and struggle and conflict. And again, Marx was not somebody who was interested in the question of conflict. Previous philosophers, including Hegel, really wanted to understand how social change happened. But on the other hand, in terms of orientation, in terms of their political position, these two schools of thought, the conflict theory as well as the structural functionalism, are seen as kind of antithetical. They are seen as kind of opposite, because structural functionalists understand conflict as something negative. When we discussed George Simmel, we saw that Simmel is one among the very first conflict theorists who spoke about the positive aspects of conflict. He spoke about how social conflicts provides for increasing social solidarity and increasing social control, a sense of increased sense of belongingness to a society. But otherwise, in the conventional narrations of all the structural functionalists or all the functional school, you will see conflict is seen as something unwanted, as something that is negative, something that is disruptive, something that has the ability to sabotage the existing system. So traditionally, even within sociological circle, functionalism is seen as a more conservative kind of theorization, whereas conflict theory is seen as a kind of a more radical social theory, a theory which imagines radical outcomes, a theory that imagines alternative, more radical social order. So this is something extremely important. And for theorists of conflict theory, you know that again has so many different strands, so many different variants. People who believed in the political project of Marx, people who did not believe in the political project of Marx but still were interested in the question of understanding social conflict and social change. So it's a very broad, extremely rich area of intellectual engagement. So conflict theory, in that sense, is an extremely diverse and extremely rich set of theorizations, starting with Marxists and then the conventional orthodox Marxists and the neo-Marxists and a host of different people with a host of different labels. And so it will be very difficult. It will be very challenging for us to get some idea about the overall nature of conflict theory in a very short period of time. But I'm really trying to summarize some of the key people, some of the interesting people and important people. So it is better equipped to explain social change and transformation in comparison with functionalism, as we discussed so far, because conflict theory looks at how rapid social changes happen, why that there could be a kind of much faster transformation taking place in a society. So since unlike structural functionalism that is preoccupied with the question of order, conflict theory looks at the kind of power relation, the kind of disagreements, competition, violence, and change of order, the introduction of new social orders, and so change is the focal point of focal point of conflict theory. So there are some of these important central assumptions of conflict theory. People have several interests. Many of them are in conflict with others, most importantly emerging from material conditions. So conflict theory does not understand society as a very nice, peaceful setting where everybody lives happily and everybody helps each other. That kind of very positive picture is not something shared by the people of conflict theory. They argue that there are very distinct social groups in society. Okay? People, it could be power, it could be prestige, it could be wealth, it could be something else. Mostly revolving around the material condition. They don't talk about other non-material conditions, but non-material conditions become a part of the whole story later in the later theorizations. So they understand, for them, for conflict theorists, starting with Marx and others, conflict theory, even with Hegel, conflict theory, society is a place where differently positioned people into specific interest groups are constantly, negotiating with each other, constantly struggling with each other in order to protect their material interest. And then what constitutes this material interest is the major center of discussion and debate. What are these material conditions? And we know that for Marx, this entire material condition he reduced it to economy, whereas Weber did not agree that. Weber argued that along with the material condition, which is described by using the term class, the status and power are important. And a host of other scholars have really tried to make very, very interesting insights about this whole thing. But fundamentally, they all share the argument that this conflict society is not a very peaceful, it's not a very, peaceful and nice place to be. And second is this whole question about power as a core of social relationship and power as coercive as well. And second important element of conflict theory is that they're really preoccupied with the question of power. If structural functionalists were preoccupied with the question of social order, conflict theorists are preoccupied with the question of power. When structural functionalists argue that there is an order in society, there is an equilibrium in a society, there is a peace in society, there's some kind of a tranquility, or there's a status quo in society, conflict theorists would agree that of course there is a tranquility, there is a peace, and there is a status quo, but they would want to ask the question, how is this peace or how is this order made possible? Because we know that any amount of order, any amount of equilibrium requires some kind of a balance, some kind of a power play. Okay? The absence of change or equilibrium doesn't mean that there is no power. So power plays an extremely important role in giving us the impression that a particular society is completely in the state of equilibrium, or there is social order in a society. We can even talk about a feudal society which is completely in order, or we can talk about a society with slavery as a society which is completely in order, because if the slaves don't try to resist, they don't try to revolt, they simply do the work that is asked by their masters, and if there is no revolt, if there is no agitation, then you can call it as a place with a lot of order. But is it what the sociologists really want to understand? So then the Marxists or the conflict theorists would ask the question, how is this order maintained? How is this order brought about? What is the kind of a power relation that establishes and perpetuates this kind of order? And that is a very, very uncomfortable question. You must be knowing that. That question has a lot of potential to disrupt this order. That question has a lot of potential to subvert this particular social order. And that is a very uncomfortable question that many people refuse to ask. And the scholars who belong to this particular group, they did not hesitate to ask the question. And they also think that power is as coercive as well. So it's not only that power exists, but this power has a coercive element, an important Weberian and Marxian understanding. When there is an order, because you can't have a society where there is complete equal distribution of power. And in most of the society, if there is a semblance of order, it's because there is very absolute kind of power is employed. And the power has a coercive character. Power can be used to influence others. It can be used to make people obey, to fall in line. It has this coercive element. It has the ability to inflict pain. Punishments can follow the power. So they really want to understand how that power in its diverse forms are understood, are employed, are distributed, how it is monopolized, how it is executed, whether it is resisted or whether it is accepted without in the absence of any other option. So these were the important preoccupations or important points of analysis of conflict theorists. Then ideas and values as weapons used by groups to advance its interests. debates on ideology and legitimacy. This is yet another very, very important point, because everybody knows that. We know that human beings are ruled, they are governed not always on the basis of threat of violence. We throughout history, of course, there could be different periods in history where extreme form of violence was used to elicit obedience. But that is not true for all time, and it is also not something very durable. It's not something enduring. You can't use force in order to keep a section of people under your control. Rather, everybody agreed, including Hegel and Marx and later scholars, especially Gramsci, a very, very important Marxian scholar. Gramsci realizes, Frankfurt School scholars realize that this ideology and ideas, the realm of ideas, play an extremely important role in making people obey, in spite of the knowledge or without the knowledge that these things are not to the best of their interest. These are not the best arrangements for them. So how is it possible? Why that there are certain ideologies, very powerful ideologies, they have been designed and then executed and then perpetuated in such a manner that it always supports the more powerful people at the expense of the sufferings of the vast majority of the people. And how does it possible? Why that this vast majority of the people who are at the receiving end do not realize it? What are the mechanisms through which these ideologies and then ideas are perpetuated without the people who are at the receiving end revolting against it seriously. So these were some of the important questions. These were some of the important rallying points of scholars who belong to conflict theorization. And they also argued that they also think that a completely value neutral position analysis is not possible, or rather it's not required in social sciences. So they don't really believe in the argument or the position of this armchair theorist, something that we have discussed when we discussed Karl Marx. Marx was not an armchair theorist. He did not believe in getting some very cozy, comfortable professorship in some university and then live his life as a renowned economist or philosopher. Rather, he deliberately chose a very troublesome, very extremely difficult personal life. He had to flee from country from countries after countries and finally settle down in London. So all these people, and you will see when we discuss critical school, the scholars who started this critical school in Frankfurt in 1923, they all had to flee Germany when Adolf Hitler and Nazi ideology came into power, because these intellectuals and their arguments were completely against the ideology of Hitler. These people were extremely critical of fascism, and that was the time when Adolf Hitler was targeting the intellectuals, so they have to leave Germany, and that's true with a host of other scholars. So they did not, in their personal life, they did not believe that a completely value neutral analysis is possible. Neither it's possible nor it is required. They argue that such a position, whether you don't take any particular position, you pretend as if you are providing a very completely neutral analysis. You don't take sides. So you think that neutrality is a very, very, very important virtue. Whereas these people don't agree with that. They would say that in an extremely exploitative situation, in an extremely violent society, taking no sides means that you are siding with the perpetrator. You are siding with the more powerful. And they did not agree with that. In a society of fascism, in a society of capitalist exploitation, in a society of casteist exploitation, there are scholars who think that you can always take a very neutral position and then analyze things in a very objective manner and then present it as it is. But there are other scholars who believe that activist scholars also need to take positions, very strong positions, mostly for the some of the important values of humanity. So, and hence we come back to the foundational influence of Karl Marx. Without any doubt, Karl Marx has been the most inspirational figure. He has been the most important figure even today. Okay? Even today, even in 2020, we are discussing about Karl Marx, Marxian relevance today, about his critique of religion, his analysis of capitalism, his ideas about about a host of issues, about alienation, for example. So I don't need to go into the arguments of Marx again. But Marx is the central figure. Marx is the central figure, an extremely influential, charismatic scholar who had a huge fan following, huge set of followers, and then intellectual scholars who followed his arguments. From again in a completely different spectrum. Somebody following a very orthodox Marxism, somebody reinterpreting Marxism, somebody arguing for a much more liberal understanding of Marxism. But Marx remains the central figure, and some of his important ideas like materialist conception of society, we have discussed it sufficiently, economic determinism, and again there are arguments, especially Gramsci and a host of others would argue that Marx never spoke about this economic determinism, or this whole idea of economic determinism is a very orthodox Marx. It's a very mechanical understanding of Marxism. Marx never spoke about that. And the role of ideology, whether is ideology need to be seen only as the superstructure? Is it only a byproduct of the economic structure? And these are some of the very interesting discussion which emerged later in the works of Critical School, in the works of Antonio Gramsci and a host of others. And the revolutionary spirit, of course, Marx was somebody who very strongly believed in the impending revolution, which he very strongly believed that will overthrow the capitalist system, and a far better egalitarian social system will come into picture, and commitment to working class and so on. So Marx was personally committed to the question of working class, and his sympathies lied with them. He looked at the bourgeoisie as an exploitative class. So Marx remains the core ideological inspiration, or the political inspiration of a host of thinkers who belong to this category of conflict theory. Then we have Max Weber, again, who dealt with questions of social stratification, who dealt with question of social differentiation, who argued that stratification is something very important, but it cannot be reduced to that of class alone. And Weberian intervention is something extremely important. And a host of conflict sociologists are heavily influenced by Weber. His insistence that you need to take into account the status question, you need to take into account the political question, political power, and they cannot be reduced to that of class. Class has to be seen as an independent, manifestation of stratification. So these two, along with Hegel, of course, Hegel becomes extremely important in the latter theorizations. So these people, especially Marx and Weber and Hegel, represent some of the important scholars. So there are a lot of scholars who belong to this particular conflict theory. There are scholars who work on the elites. There is Veblen who worked on this elite class theory, looked at how there are very specific set of people who always occupy this elite position. And there is C. Wright Mills in America, who though not a typical Marxist, always was interested in the question of class and industrialization and industrialism kind of prospects. But one of the most important, interesting group of scholars whom I just want to introduce to you is this school of critical sociologists, or critical sociology is again a broad term, and one of the most important section or important group is this
Frankfurt School, which I just mentioned earlier. So they established this Institute of Social Research at the University of Frankfurt in 1923, and they argued that the primary responsibility of the scholars is to be critical of the power elite or the establishment and so on. So this whole idea of critical sociology, the argument that the primary responsibility of social science is to be critical of the society, of the power relation, of the power elite, of the establishment, of the dominant class. This is an extremely important argument of the Frankfurt School. So they would argue that when you live in a particular period in time, you can't escape the most dominant ideology, and this particular dominant ideology provides you with certain interpretation of the world. And unless you develop critical faculties to understand that, for example, their critique of mass culture, their critique of popular culture, it talks about that. Okay? So unless you are critical of the dominant ideologies, then you will never be able to see through these processes. A very important quality of social, sociological imagination. So they had taken it up among themselves as this ability to develop critique. They were extremely fascinated by this concept of critique, and that includes Max Horkheimer, Theodor Adorno, Marcus Herbert Marcuse, and Erich Fromm. And Erich Fromm was heavily influenced by psychoanalysis, and they brought in psychoanalysis as a very, very, very important element of analyzing this whole question of power and domination. And they all believed that there is a deep moral commitment to egalitarian society. They all very strongly believed that a scholar has a moral responsibility to strive for a more egalitarian society. And they started this institute in 1923, but they came under enormous pressure from Hitler, and they had to close down the department, and they left for different places. Many of them went to USA, many of them stayed back there. Two of them came back, Horkheimer and Adorno came back. So this particular school, this critical school, is something very, very influential, extremely popular, heavily celebrated in the sociological circles, and they criticized a host of Marxian notions as well. And another important scholar who comes much later is Jürgen Habermas, a German sociologist, a philosopher rather, who became extremely one of the most important, influential intellectuals of our times. Habermas, his arguments about public sphere, his argument about communication, communicative rationality, and a host of other things. So this critical school, they were quite critical of the orthodox Marxian economic determinism. They did not agree with the orthodox Marxian view that ideologies or ideas are merely a byproduct of economy. They did not agree with that argument, and they also believed that this space of ideology is something extremely important for you to fight. It cannot be simply left as an epiphenomenon of your economic substance. And they analyze the concept of culture, ideology, etc., and use psychoanalysis extensively in their work. And they could argue that many of this popular culture, many of the soap culture that you see, what function do they do to the ordinary people? Why that one of the major concerns for them was that why that vast majority of the people, in spite of they living under extremely harsh realities, why don't they really respond? Why are they not really seeing the enemy clearly and then organize themselves? Why that a political movement is not taking place even in some of the most challenging times in Germany, for that matter, or in Europe, for that matter, during 1920s and 30s. Instead of that, fascism was on the growth. Okay. So they look into that, and then Habermas, as I mentioned, I'm not going into the details, but extremely influential scholar. Then C. Wright Mills, an American sociologist whom we started with this course. We discussed C. Wright Mills and his arguments about sociology, and his work on elites is important. Another very important name is Pierre Bourdieu, a French sociologist, extremely important and influential sociologist. His major concern was with the question of reproduction of class. How is that this class distinction is reproduced? Why that the upper class is always able to maintain that superiority, and why is that it's so difficult for the lower class to come up, and what are the mechanisms which really ensure the stability of this class hierarchy, and his concept of habitus, his concept of different forms of capital, especially cultural capital. These are extremely important concepts, extremely important theorizations, which are very, very effectively being used even in the contemporary time. So extremely important people. Then we have a whole set of other scholars, including Louis Coser and Randall Collins and then Dahrendorf and a host of others who do not really share the kind of a political stand, or what we can call it as a left political position, unlike of the critical scholars and others. These people are, of course, they were influenced by Marxian thinking, but they don't really take the kind of political position, unlike that of the previous scholars. So, for example, Louis Coser talked about this functional conflict theory. He talks about what are the functions of conflict theory. If you remember, Simmel spoke about it, but he elaborates that thing further. He talks about the manifest functions of conflict and latent functions of conflict, manifest functions as well as manifest dysfunctions, latent functions and latent dysfunctions. And Randall Collins, who argued for a micro-level analysis of power relations rather than talking about large structures of class exploitation, large sectors of working class and bourgeois as two broader ones. Then you have Ralph Dahrendorf, who presented a dialectical conflict perspective, which still represents one of the best efforts to incorporate the insights of Marx and to a lesser extent Weber and Simmel into a coherent and non-evaluative set of theoretical propositions. So this, as I mentioned earlier, this tradition of conflict theory is something very, very rich in terms of the number of scholars involved, the number of theoretical arguments involved, and especially after 80s with the discovery of Antonio Gramsci, the Italian scholar, with the discovery of his written works, especially Prison Notebook, and that has brought in quite a lot of new energy into the academic works of conflict theorists. His arguments about hegemony, his arguments against about consent, and these are some of the very, very fascinating theoretical arguments about how these power relations work in a society. So the kind of inspiration that is provided by Marx, the focus that you can't escape the question of power. You can't really escape the question of power in different forms, and that is a central question, along with a commitment for a more egalitarian society, have been the hallmarks of conflict theory. So let us stop here and we'll meet for the next class. Thank you.